Now for the VIP bracket on the turbo, you have replacing the third one up on this side. Make sure you don't loosen all the screws, just maybe these three on this side, leave these tight so that the gearbox doesn't shift. And so this is a spacer that has an ear on it, and the piece sits on top of that ear. And there's a Teflon washer in between for a bearing, and that gets snugged up just tight enough that it can still turn freely, but no play. And then on the other side, again, now we're gonna have to tighten all the stuff over here. 70 foot-pounds on bolts that go right through, and 40 on those that are threaded into the engine. And we can loosen these now, these two, or might be able to just do this one, remove the spacer here and replace with this spacer that gives a guide. And we want to then set that up and down in a way where when we look through the hole here, it's centered on it. And then we're going to pin this with a washer and a cotter pin. And then back here we have the bracket that goes on here with two 110 millimeter long 8 millimeter bolt and 120 millimeter long bolt back here, and nut on each side and spacers in there, and then it gets hooked up like right here, and that should be hooked up in a sense that this floats, but enough spacers underneath there that the whole thing is not binding and everything can move freely in and out. Then of course the wires, you have to route those into the airplane, and either a toggle switch or a prop controller will control the 12-volt voltage to move the actuator in and out. You can adjust it here by loosening this and sliding this in or out. Right now it's all the way bottomed out, the actuator, which means this will be almost all the way back so that it can move all the way this way when the actuator moves out. Now when we use the VIP, variable in-flight propeller system, the thermostat, it can still go here, but it'll have to come out a little bit because it interferes with some of these parts here. So you could have it a little bit further out, a little longer hose here, and then everything else could be the same. Or you could just run an elbow here and come down and then put the thermostat here. The closer it is to cylinder head, the better though. Okay, heater is ready. So we've got black ground here, orange, yellow, and red. Those are the four coming out of here. Out of those four, everything goes to the switch except for the black. Black loops right here, and black goes to ground. All right. Then on the switch we have the orange, red, yellow, and green, and they correspond as it says on the sheet that comes with this. And out of those, all of them go to the heater except for the positive, the green, which comes out with the ground here. And that's the wiring of the heater. Then you need 5 amp fuse on the green, and then this goes to ground, and it's up and running. All right, do a quick test before we mount it in the airplane. Negative, positive on the battery, and step 1 and 2 and 3. Okay, ready to be mounted. And then we have a fitting in here, and that's the final thing that's going to leave the engine. And it's the hose for the manifold pressure. All right, so we finished up the breather, crankcase breather. We got one from here, and we got the one from here. And now we tied them right there. And we stuck them underneath here, right on the hottest part of the turbocharger. And that'll, any little bit of fumes will evaporate. All right, and then we have installed the gray stripe loom on the starter cable. That's nylon. Make sure it's nylon gray stripe, otherwise it'll melt. And then we're going to do the same thing with this one here, from the alternator to the starter. Okay, so we put a very, very small amount of Moly Coat 111 compound on our hoses. Put the clamp on and then rotate it into where it goes. There's no pressure in this cooling system. We still want to have nice beads and everything, but we can have a little bit of Moly Coat on these so that you can work on it very easily. Now we're going to do 45 degrees here, and we're going to be as close as possible here. We cut off just enough straight here. I'm going to angle this back. All right, so it's fairly simple. I mean, since we're looking at it from the bottom up now, as we're looking at the airplane from underneath, these have to be at the bottom, which means they'll be as high in the airplane as possible. Make sure that that's the case. So they'll be the closest to the engine. Just grab one of the sides and we just basically put that in place here. We can see need a little bit of trimming right there. So let me do that first. All right, so on this one, we're going to start supplying just for the Super Duty, a rear fence like this, just to block that off. So it's all blocked from the front to the back. If somebody wants to add, like, you know, a piece here, maybe we can include it because we have some. But it's a lot harder to close it off behind here than it is to just close it right here. And get a nice seal in an air box. A couple of slots here will be included in this piece. We just use right stuff underneath here, any kind of sealer, and then rivet it to the side. And that closes the box off. In fact, having this air trip over here on the back on a slow airplane probably help with the cooling rather than hinder it. Get a little bit of suction. All right, let's quickly go through the Viking View wires. So we got oil pressure right here, transducer, and that's a red and white on our instrument. And brought it in here, tied it off there, and a little clamp in there, tied it here. And then basically just, it's always a nice area like underneath here you can bring stuff. And then out here, so that's oil pressure. Now we've got coolant temp on our instrument, that's orange, the wire. And gearbox, we've got green. Routed those through here. And just along with everything else so that it's all organized. And then we already had the temperature out of the intercooler. Routed that there and grouped it together with all the other stuff. And into the intercooler, gonna group that together too. All right, so now let's take a look at all the things that are coming off the engine so far. So over here we have a hose for the heater. And then we have a ground strap ready to go. Another backup ground strap ready to go. Because they're straps and very flexible, we don't have to worry about strain relieving. If these were cables, we couldn't just come right off the terminal. We'd have to then strain relieve to something before we left the engine. And we got the cable for the ECU. We've got another heater hose. We've got the gearbox breather hose. We have the starter cable. We have instrumentation, so we've got into the intercooler, out of the intercooler, into the engine. oil pressure ground to the engine for the instrumentation. They like to see that grounded right on the engine. I just ended up putting that. There's a bolt down in here that was handy. Let's see. Right there. It was just kind of like right there. It was a flat surface. So I ended up using that one. And two more things, orange, and that was coolant, and green for gearbox. So all this stuff is ready to go and be hooked up to the airplane to run and read the engine and to get some heat for our feet. And we need one more hose, so we removed a plug here and we screwed a 90 fitting in, and that's going to be running also along here to the back, and that's going to be for the coolant bottle. And we're using the topmost fitting to get as much air out of the engine as possible. In order to screw this around, just put some rags underneath here and take this little gizmo off, 3 bolts, clean the surfaces by just blotting with a paper towel. And then after you got this done, you might have to pull this one too. And then put this in, put this back in, and then this just goes right back on. It has a reusable O-ring gasket. Tighten the bolts to 120 inch-pounds and you're all set. And then we can put a hose on here and bring it to the engine. Firewall. And here's the inlet for the intercooler. It's going to be a combination of this fiberglass piece and an air box on the intercooler. So as you can see, the shape of this is the same as the cowling. So it fits right in there, and you can use Hysol and glue it in, or you can just rivet it in, whatever is easier. All right, so you have to build your air box, just rivet it together, and then get a little overlap on the sides here. This rivet is like right down on it. And we pre-bent the back end quite a bit so that it seals good here. If you do end up with gaps, just use some sealer at the end, some silicone or right stuff. When you drill these holes, we use the 5/32 rivets or number 5. Make sure you don't drill too deep. You can drill through this first plate, there's no issue. And you can drill into these fins, but you don't want to drill into this tank because you'll get an air leak. So the rivets end up inside there. So you just push on the rivets when you pull them. Okay, so this is what your air box should look like. And on a Zenith Super Duty, you can't have any more than about 4 inches from here to out here. I think 4 3/8, and you start hitting the cowling. You can build this after you do the cowling, of course, but 4 inches should make it. Now, if you need even more cooling, you can always silicone the inside here, any seams and all that. But for now, we're gonna fly and see what we get. Okay, we did the mounting of the intercooler. A lot of this stuff obviously is already done when you receive the engine, but I'm covering it all as I build up this one. So you want a elbow straight here that just makes it in between here so that it can never come off. So we usually end up pushing the intercooler up while we install the bottom rubber mount here. And the whole thing should be a little bit able to move a little bit. So we also have a mount back here. And there's a Teflon washer on each side of that screw. And we never tighten that bolt all the way over. We tighten it, but then we back it off a little bit so that the whole intercooler can move just a little bit. And then from there, we've got the 1 7/8 hose on here onto this 90-degree elbow, and then that clears the pulley back there. It's at an angle coming off like that, and then it goes up into the turbocharger. So the hot compressed air comes out of the turbo, goes through here into the intercooler, and then into the engine. and we're going to be measuring the temperature of the turbocharger here. Put an adapter in depending on what size probe you have, and then we're going to measure how efficient the intercooler is by measuring the air on the other side of the cooler before it goes into the engine. And we can live with up to 250 Fahrenheit here, that's max, and 150 Fahrenheit here is max going into the engine. 140 is better. Next, we're going to install the oil pressure transducer. Oil pressure transducer is right here. If you look at the hex of it, it'll say 0 to 10 bar. If it says 0 to 5 bar, then that's the wrong one. That's the one that goes to the fuel pressure. And this could look differently depending on what instrument you get. The adapter piece back here stays with the engine. That's an adapter that's screwed in and Loctited to the engine. So you want to put a wrench on that every time so it doesn't back out. And that adapts it back to an 1/8 inch pipe thread, which is what these transducers are. And then we're going to continue on, and we're going to install the gearbox temperature probe, which we did up here. We're working on that right now. Doesn't matter which hole it goes in here. We picked the back one because we're not really going to use the front one for anything except maybe vent it when we fill it if we want to fill it quicker. You can also fill it here slowly, and it'll backwash on you if you're not careful, but you can just do it slowly. If you take the plug out, then it's a little bit easier to fill it. So I've already got that in there, and it's the sealer that seals it and not a lot of torque, so that's tight enough for that. And then next we're going to do a coolant temp probe, and we can do any one of these holes for the coolant temp probe. And the coolant probe has been installed. When you install this pipe, make sure it's in far enough that it clears the engine mount. Dawn, a little bit of Dawn and water, you can coat the pipes with that and it'll slide together easier. Don't use any kind of silicone grease or anything because we want it to dry and not stay in there because it'll come apart if you use something slippery. But if you use a little bit of soap and water, it'll disappear over time. All right, so we do the air temperature coming out of the turbocharger right here. So we blue Loctited in the adapter because we're down to an 1/8 inch NPT, and that's actually like you can screw that in ahead of time if you're using thermocouples like these that we supply with our instrument. And then there's a little ferrule on here, which means you can actually adjust how far you want that to be in and out. So you want it to be as far into what you're measuring as you can. So you just push it in. We got lots of room in here, so, and then you have the bend, so you want to stay clear of the bend. Pull it back a little bit, and then when you tighten this down, what happens is that ferrule will crimp onto here and it becomes a permanent assembly. And then you can run your cables up to the junction block, and this will then measure the turbocharger temperature, outlet temperature. And we're going to screw one in over here in a second, and that will be the intake temperature for the engine after the intercooler. And we'd like to see like a 100-degree drop through the intercooler if we have enough air going through here. Thermostat, these work pretty good if you ever had to remove it or So that has to go towards the radiator. Black mark goes up because there's a little bleed hole up inside there. Look at our Viking 175 engine install instructions, and it shows how to put this thing in. Okay, I'm making my cable between the starter and the alternator so the alternator can charge the system. Look for welding cable. Welding cable, you know, you need at least like an 8 gauge and between the alternator and the starter, and a 6 gauge between the starter and the airplane. But the welding wires are very, very thin strands, and there's lots and lots of them. So the cable is very flexible. Okay, which is a great thing when you're vibrating around on an engine. I've seen these cables right there fail at the alternator several times. So whatever you can do, make a nice flexible cable. And you can get welding cable like this anywhere online, and it just is a lot softer. Of course, you also need to strain relieve it at each end, but that's a great start. Start with something very flexible. You might also be able to get tinned cable, like welding cable. A little bit harder to find, but they do make that as well. Alright, so we did a flexible welding cable between here and here. And I'm going to add some loom to it just because it's laying on top of the intercooler here. And that's that. And then we have a regular, it's also a flexible cable, but it's tinned and it's gauge 6 gauge, and it's going to go, we get a clamp right here that strain relieves it right there off the starter, and then up through here, and we're just going to go out with all the other stuff here, and then all this stuff is going to go different places, but it all kind of is collected along the top of the intake manifold. I'm going to put some loom on that too, since that's a hot battery cable and we don't ever want that to short against ground. Alright, it's 2024. Let's do an updated Super Duty or Viking 195 installation video. So we're going to have a heater, or the customer, so we took the plug out and we screwed the 3/8 barbed by quarter NPT fitting in there. And we use on everything the Loctite 567. Okay, next we're going to add a brass 90, because obviously the hose isn't going to run into the propeller. We don't want that. And we didn't have enough room here to do a 90, so we're doing this. And we're going to come up here. We're not going to route the hose over by the turbo because it's too hot. So our goal is to come up here, and then we're going to go back to the firewall and into the heater. And we didn't make it too tight. We want room here to put our temperature probes in, so we brought it up into the air a little bit. Use 2 of the large tie wraps here. Just tied it to this really thick fuel injection hose or tube here. And then don't worry about that. It's really, really thick, so you're not going to have any issue with that. And then just along the top of the manifold, out through one of these holes, and eventually that's going to go right to the heater. That's one side done. Very simple. Okay, next we attach the air filter elbow, and then attach the air filter. And then here we're doing 5/8 heater hose, 5/8 elbow, and then up here you get a piece of 5/8 aluminum tubing and just hammer one end close like that, about a 1/4 inch fish mount. Put a clamp on it and leave it too long, and then stick it down in here. And then any kind of fumes will just burn off against the hot turbocharger. Okay, and we have another breather on this side, so we'll just run a 3/8 fuel line up through here. There's a passage right through here, goes right here underneath, and then we're going to cut another piece of tubing and stick that in there. 5/16. We're gonna put that right next to the other one, and then just tie these together. That takes care of the crankcase breathing system. And just so you know, there is a product from Evans that's you can put in the system and run it, and then change it later, you know, before you fly and taxi and all that. And it absorbs any kind of moisture that's in the engine before you use the NPG. We sometimes use it, and it's not a bad product. It seems to vacuum out better if you close the back side rather than having a lot of air go through. Just have it suck out the moisture with a ball of paper at this time. Seems to be drawing out pretty good. Okay, so we'll just go one hose at a time here. Here's the breather hose for the back of the gearbox. It has to go to a little can on the firewall. So we want to get that like turned to the aft immediately underneath this fuel hose, and then just parallel it with the heater hose if you got one on top of the manifold, and then back to the firewall. And that clears enough area to get the thermostat installed, which we'll do next. So thermostat has a 2 radiator and an up dot. So we want that up because there's a hole in the thermostat there, and we want to bleed air. And then 2 radiator arrow is away from the engine. So we're going to install it right down in here. We have to get a piece of hose, and we're going to put that in place. Now, just while we're talking about that, this area is also used for the VIP actuator to move a rod through the propeller. So if you have a VIP system, likely this will be mounted somewhere else in the hose that goes to the radiator. But since we don't have VIP here now, we don't have an actuator bar going in here. There's nothing really in the way, and we might as well just have it up here close to the cylinder head. Okay, so I put a little piece of hose on there, and I use the Radiator clamp, and that's the 42.5 millimeter. Now, to be able to remove the thermostat easy afterwards, I'm thinking I might want to use the spring clamps. And so we got those, and if you want to use those, you can use regular pliers, but it's a little bit safer to use the specialty pliers that are made for it. You can rotate that, pick up the bucket, and then it's a ratcheting thing, so it holds it real good. Just another alternative. Now you can use different clamps here too, but I kind of like to be able to remove it easy if I needed to. Okay, we also installed the valve here for the quick drain. Now this part of it has a jam nut here, and there's a little Teflon washer in there. You don't want to lose that. And that's just so you can rotate it to where you want it when you put the hose on. Now to install it, I don't use any gasket underneath here. It's a machine surface. Different engines are different. For instance, this one, it won't clear here. So I take a file and I file away in order to clear as I rotate it down and let it seat. I clean it all out with acetone, tip the engine so that there's no oil running to that location, and then I use plenty of blue Loctite on the threads and use a Q-tip and put it inside as well and screw that in all the way down. And I have blue Loctite working as my sealer and also to keep it from coming out easily. The way that it works is, you're gonna flip this up and move it, and that opens it. and then when you flip it until it goes click into that groove, then it's locked. And that's something that Alyssa sells for these engines. It's a very good, high quality one. So some people want that instead of undoing the plug.